Somewhere, right now, a stranger is watching you eat breakfast. They know your coffee order. They know the name of your dog. They know what your voice sounds like when you're trying not to cry on camera. They've watched you grow up in 15-minute increments for 3 years. They have never met you. They never will. And somehow, they feel closer to you than the people sitting in your own kitchen. This isn't a story about fame. It's not even really a story about the internet. It's a story about a switch that got flipped somewhere in the last decade. A switch in what your nervous system counts as being known. And once that switch flips, it doesn't flip back easily. It just quietly redirects where you go looking for the feeling of being seen. Here's the strange part. You probably haven't noticed the switch flipping in your own life because nothing about it feels engineered. It feels like connection. It feels warmer than scrolling, more personal than browsing. You watch someone talk directly into a camera, directly at you, using the word you the way a friend would, and something in your chest responds the way it responds to an actual friend. That response isn't a malfunction. It's not you being naive or parasocial in some embarrassing way. It's your social brain doing exactly what it evolved to do, and doing it in an environment it was never designed for. For most of human history, a face looking at me and talking meant one thing: a person in front of me who could see me back. There was no category in the ancestral mind for a face that talks to thousands of people simultaneously and registers none of them. So when that situation appeared, first on television, now multiplied a millionfold through a phone screen, your brain didn't invent a new file for it. It reached for the nearest old one. Familiar face, direct address, consistent presence over time. That's the file marked relationship. And your nervous system filed it there, because filing it anywhere else would have required a kind of category that simply doesn't exist in the architecture you inherited. This was named decades before any of this technology existed by two researchers watching something much smaller: people's attachment to radio and television hosts. Donald Horton and Richard Wohl called it parasocial interaction, a one-sided bond with a media figure who feels present, responsive, and personal despite having no idea you exist. They were writing in 1956, describing housewives who felt they knew their favorite radio announcer the way they knew a neighbor. They had no way of knowing they were describing the operating system underneath the feeling that would define, for millions of people, what closeness feels like 70 years later, just multiplied by a number their imaginations couldn't have reached. Think about what's actually required for your nervous system to register someone as known, not liked, not interesting. Known in the bodily sense, the sense that makes your shoulders drop slightly when they appear, the sense that makes their voice register, faintly, as safety. It turns out the requirements are almost embarrassingly simple. A face you've seen enough times to recognize instantly, a voice with a consistent emotional register, and the sensation of being looked at and spoken to directly. That's it. That's the whole formula your ancestors needed, because in their environment, anyone who met those three conditions actually was known to them and actually could be affected by them. The formula was never built to distinguish between a person who loves you back and a camera lens pointed at your face from 4 feet away. There was no need to build that distinction. Nothing in the entire history of the species, until extremely recently, presented a face that satisfied all three conditions while remaining, in every way that matters, a stranger. Here's what you'd expect if you stop to reason it out logically. You'd expect that knowing this, knowing it's one-sided, knowing the warmth isn't mutual, knowing the creator doesn't actually know your name, would dissolve the feeling. Surely once you see the mechanism, the magic breaks. It doesn't. This is the part that should unsettle you a little, because it reveals something about how feeling works that thinking can't override. Studies on these one-sided bonds have found something almost paradoxical. People don't just tolerate the asymmetry, they often report it as effective. Not effective despite being one-sided, effective partly because it's one-sided. There's no risk of rejection, no risk of being boring or too much or misread. The face on the screen will never sigh, never get distracted mid-sentence, never leave the room irritated. It's intimacy with all of the warmth and almost none of the danger that usually comes attached to warmth. Think about what real closeness actually costs you, most of the time. To be known by an actual person, you have to risk being misunderstood by them. You have to risk boring them, disappointing them, catching them on a day they don't have the bandwidth for you. Every real bond carries a small, constant possibility of rejection, simply because the other person is free, and freedom cuts both ways. A parasocial bond quietly removes that possibility entirely. The creator cannot reject you, because they were never in a position to accept you in the first place. There's a strange comfort in a closeness that comes with no exposure, even though, on reflection, exposure was always the part that made closeness mean something. And so the twist isn't that parasocial bonds are a lesser form of connection that fools unsophisticated people. The twist is that they work on a need that's completely real, completely legitimate, and almost perfectly suited to being met this way, which is exactly what makes them so easy to lean on, and so easy to lean on too far. So what's actually happening, mechanically, when you feel close to someone who's never met you? Start with what closeness has always required, biologically. A face, attention that seems aimed at you, a voice with consistent emotional texture, and repetition over time. Your brain doesn't have a separate sensor for this is mutual versus this is one directional. It infers mutuality from pattern, not from verified fact. A face that returns week after week, speaking directly into a lens that mimics eye contact, narrating its own inner life in your direction, that pattern is, neurologically, almost indistinguishable from a friend who keeps showing up. There's a reason this works on you specifically through video, and not just through text or photographs. The camera lens sits at the exact distance and height a real conversation partner's eyes would sit. The creator looks into it the way you'd look into the eyes of someone you were confiding in. Every cue your nervous system uses to register direct address, the held gaze, the slight forward lean, the dropped intimate register of the voice, is reproducible on camera, and increasingly deliberately reproduced, because creators have learned, often through trial and error rather than any cynical master plan, that this is what makes people stay. The output looks identical to your nervous system, whether the intention behind it is genuine warmth toward an audience or simply a format that performs well. Your body has no instrument for telling the difference. Researchers studying these bonds in social media contexts, building on the foundational work of Horton and Wall, and later extended by researchers like Beck and colleagues studying users in South Korea, found a specific and important asymmetry. Parasocial dependency correlated with higher loneliness. Real, reciprocal relationships correlated with lower loneliness. Both were relationships in the loose sense. Only one of them was metabolizing the actual hunger underneath. That hunger has a name in psychology: the need to belong, to be known by someone who can also be affected by you, who carries you in their mind the way you carry them in yours. A parasocial bond gives you half of that experience with startling precision. The warmth, the familiarity, the sense of being addressed. What it cannot give you, no matter how long you watch, is the half that requires being carried back. You can know everything about someone's face and nothing of what it would feel like for them to actually notice you're gone. And here's the part that makes this more than a sad footnote about modern life. The brain doesn't seem to charge a different rate for the real thing versus the half thing. Watching a familiar, friendly face can measurably reduce the feeling of loneliness in the moment. The nervous system gets something out of it that isn't nothing, which is precisely the problem. It's not nothing. It's just not enough. And not enough but real is a much harder thing to walk away from than fake. This is where it stops being an interesting fact about psychology and starts reshaping actual lives. When the half thing is available constantly, instantly, and without any of the friction of real intimacy, no scheduling, no vulnerability, no risk of being a burden, it becomes the path of least resistance. Not because people are choosing an over-real connection in some deliberate way, because it's right there, and it works, in the way a painkiller works on a headache without addressing what's causing it. So the texture of a life can shift, quietly, over years. You become fluent in being moved by people who do not know you exist, and slightly out of practice at the more demanding, more reciprocal, more interruptible work of being known by someone who lives down the hall. Real intimacy is inefficient. It requires you to be boring sometimes. It requires someone else's bad day to actually rearrange your evening. A parasocial bond never asks that of you, which is exactly why it can start to feel, falsely, like the better deal. Consider what happens during an ordinary hard week. The parasocial face is available the second you want it. No waiting for a reply, no risk of catching someone at a bad time, no chance the algorithm-favored creator will be too tired to perform warmth tonight. Compare that to texting an actual friend at 11 at night. There's a real chance they don't respond for hours. A real chance they're dealing with something of their own. A real chance you'll feel, briefly, like you've asked for too much. None of that risk exists with a screen. So under stress, when you're least equipped to tolerate risk, the frictionless option wins by default, not because you've judged it better, but because judgment isn't really what's choosing in that moment. There's a particular shape of loneliness this produces, and it doesn't look like isolation from the outside. It looks like a full inbox of notifications and an empty house. It looks like feeling caught up on someone's entire emotional year while your own roommate doesn't know you got bad news last week. It can look, paradoxically, like having more relationships than you can keep track of, while being unable to name a single person who would notice within a day if you went quiet. The researchers who study this call it a mismatch between perceived social support and real social support. You feel resourced until the actual moment you need someone to physically show up and discover that warmth watched is not the same as warmth that arrives. And there's a particular cruelty in finding that out only in the moment you most need it not to be true. But step back further, because this isn't really a story about influencers or screens or even the internet specifically. It's a much older story wearing new clothes. Humans have always built relationships with things that couldn't fully reciprocate. Gods who didn't answer in words, ancestors who could only be addressed, characters in books who felt more vivid than the people in the next room. Every era has had its own version of intimacy at a distance. What's different now isn't the shape of the longing, it's the volume and immediacy of the supply. You used to have to wait a week for the next chapter, the next episode, the next letter. Now the face that knows your name without knowing you is available at 2 a.m., mid-anxiety spiral, the instant you reach for it. The hunger is ancient. The frictionless availability is new. And frictionless availability changes everything about how a craving behaves, not because the craving is different, but because nothing stands between you and feeding it anymore. James Baldwin once observed that people tend to flinch from too much unfiltered reality, not because reality is too painful to witness, but because reality, the real kind, asks something of you in return. It asks you to be changed by what you see, to let another person's actual presence cost you something. A parasocial bond is reality with that cost engineered out. You get the warmth of being addressed without the corresponding obligation to actually show up for the person addressing you, because there is no such person waiting on the other end. It is connection with the most difficult ingredient removed, which is also, not coincidentally, the ingredient that made connection mean anything in the first place. There's a phrase the poet Mary Oliver used, almost in passing, that captures the danger here more precisely than any psychology paper. She wrote about wanting to be married to amazement, to live a life that pays attention rather than one that merely consumes attention. The parasocial bond offers something that looks like amazement, a face, a voice, a feeling of being let in, but it's amazement curated for an audience of thousands, not attention paid to you specifically. It is, in the truest sense, a performance of intimacy rather than intimacy's substance. And a performance, watched enough times, can start to feel like the real architecture of your emotional life, simply because it's the structure you visit most often. This is, in the end, a story about supply outrunning the body's ability to tell sources apart. Your hunger to be known evolved in a world with almost no supply, a handful of faces, a small tribe, scarcity that forced you to invest deeply in the few bonds available. That world is gone. What replaced it is a world of nearly infinite supply of the appearance of being known, available the instant you want it, costing nothing, risking nothing. No one designed your nervous system for that ratio. It's still running the scarcity-era software, which is precisely why it mistakes abundance of the fake thing for satisfaction of the real need. So here's the reframe, and it's not the one you might expect. The reframe isn't stop watching, it's all fake. The bond isn't fake. The warmth you feel is a real neurological event, processed by real systems that don't know or care whether the face on the screen can see you back. The reframe is this: the loneliness you might be feeling isn't a sign that something is wrong with you for forming these bonds. It's a sign that one side of a two-sided need has been getting fed while the other side has been quietly starving. You're not broken for finding comfort in a familiar voice that talks at you every week. You're responding exactly the way a social creature should respond to a face, a voice, and a pattern. The miscalibration isn't in your feelings, it's in the ratio, in how much of your being known budget has migrated toward people who will never know you back, and how little is left for the people who actually could. That's a solvable ratio. It's just not solvable by force of will alone. And it's not solved by quitting the screen in a fit of guilt either. It's solved by noticing where the asymmetry has crept furthest and asking, quietly, without self-judgment, what it would take to let one real person closer than the parasocial ones currently sit. There's no 5-step plan for this, and any video that offers you one is selling you something simpler than what's actually true. What might actually help is smaller and stranger than a plan. It's a kind of honesty with yourself about which face on which screen is currently doing the emotional work that a person near you used to do or could do if you let them. Not to shame the screen face out of your life, just to notice it. To say internally, this is warmth and it is real, and it is also not going to remember my name in the morning, so let me not let it become the only place I go to feel known. That noticing doesn't require deleting anything or swearing off the thing that has, in its own limited way, kept you company. It just requires holding two truths at once, that the warmth is real and that it was never built to be the whole meal. And maybe what follows is smaller still. Maybe it's just one text to one person today that isn't about logistics. One unscheduled, slightly inefficient, slightly risky attempt at being known by someone who could, in theory, be changed by knowing you. Rilke wrote that for one human being to love another is perhaps the most difficult of all our tasks, the ultimate test, the work for which all other work is preparation. He wasn't being dramatic. He was naming the fact that real intimacy is supposed to be hard, costly, occasionally disappointing. The parasocial bond is so seductive precisely because it removes the difficulty. But the difficulty was never the flaw in real connection. It was the proof that it was real. Somewhere, right now, a stranger is still watching you eat breakfast. Or rather, you're watching them, learning the shape of a life that will never once turn around and ask how yours is going. That isn't a failure of character. It's a brain doing its oldest job in an environment built to exploit exactly how that job works. But somewhere closer than that screen, there's a person who could actually be changed by knowing you, if you let the difficulty in. The switch that got flipped can be flipped back. Not all at once, not by force, just by turning every so often toward the harder warmth, the kind that knows your name because you told them yourself and remembers it because you mattered to them while they were listening.